I'm here with Dave Groth. Dave, how's it going?
Good. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm so glad to connect with you. It's always a special day on First Ascent Podcast when a fellow Devil's Lake climber is on to talk to me.
Yeah, awesome. I'm excited to be here, and I thank you for inviting me.
When I think of like the Mount Rushmore of Devil's Lake, like your head is definitely up there, like with John Gill, Eric Zishi, Pete Cleveland, and Dave Groth. Like these are the main forefathers of Devil's Lake climbing. So I'm just so happy to talk to you.
Thank you. There might be a couple other guys I'd shove in there, but yeah, we can talk about that later.
When did you start climbing at Devil's Lake?
I started in the 82, in the early 80s. You know, I did one of these deals where I learned a little bit of rock climbing in the Boy Scouts and, you know, rappelling and all that stuff, and really didn't know that there was decent rock climbing in Wisconsin until one of my buddy's dads, who learned in the 50s and 60s at the Hoofers, he goes, "Oh, there's excellent rock climbing there." So we, bought a rope, bought some equipment, headed up to Devil's Lake, and, immediately led a 5-6 with boots and swami belts. And I was hit the ground running, And from pretty much the time I started to climb at Devil's Lake, I was full bore in it, because the company I worked for, 3 months later, they had a big union strike in which I didn't work all summer.
Oh, good for climbing.
Yeah, so I was on the road right out of the box.
Did you relocate down to the lake? Were you just living there? I picture you and Rich Beckler and Steve Sangdahl and those guys well, okay, so I've seen a picture of Rich shooting a gun in the parking lot, and it's well, that's not something that you would do if you're just there for the weekend.
That's Necedah.
That was Necedah where he was shooting the gun?
Yeah, that was the quarry. We used to be able to camp there in the quarry.
Oh.
So those days, it was very much a weekend crowd, with a lot of us guys not working. Rich was one of these guys. He did not work on Friday. He would work sometimes 3 days for his dad. He'd work he'd bang out a 40-hour week in 3 days, and then he'd head back to the lake. And yeah, we had different places we stayed. It was a little freer then. We had property we could stay at. We always had these camping gigs going, but it was everybody was kind of there late in the week, on the weekend. You'd climb 3-4 days and then head back and do some work.
Was this when the DLFA became a thing?
I didn't really start climbing with the DLFA guys. I started climbing with another group of guys, and over time, Beckler was kind of he was the guy on top of the pile, him and Sangdahl. And Sangdahl had moved out to Boulder pretty early on. I knew Steve and climbed with him a bunch early on. And then he moved, and then it was just kind of me, and I just didn't have good partners. So eventually I migrated to climb with Rich. And we had a pretty strong partnership. And there was a time there in the late 80s where we were banging stuff out pretty good, stuff that hadn't been led. When you go in there for first weird leads, Rich has a lot. I mean,
yeah, I did notice that from the guidebook. Diving in, he led a lot of stuff there for the first time.
When he passed away, I put everything he did on paper, and it was a pretty good list, and weird stuff the Rich and Famous and Pigeon Roof and the Uberschmidt and, all these little obscure 512s that I think the boys now are sort of going through that tick list and rebooted it all, the Purple Wave crew.
Which is interesting because there's definitely the next era of, hard climbers who are sort of starting at Devil's Lake. But I mean, they were very influenced by the DLFA. And for the non-Devil's Lake climbers listening, I think we got to talk about what the DLFA is. Or was. Now it's the Devil's Lake Family Association, but it was the Devil's Lake Buckness Association. Which, what the hell does that mean, Dave?
Well, I don't know. They just referred, I don't know how the fuckness thing got started. I think it just referred to a beer or whatever illicit drugs were happening at the time, as fuckness. And, in the context of that, it was like what was the Gunks group? The
The
Vulgarians?
Vulgarians. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I guess were they sort of styled after the Vulgarians? Was it like imitation is the sincerest form of flattery?
yeah, to a degree. I think the Vulgarians were like 70s. I think a lot of this stuff kind of happened at the same time. Maybe the Vulgarians by a handful of years, and then, and the DLFA was really started by Bill Russell for the most part. Bill Russell and Tommy Deutschler were kind of the godfathers of that whole thing. And Russell, for whatever reason, because he was guiding at the time, just didn't want to take part in the film, which I kind of regret because I think he would have been really good on,
Sure.
as part of the film. But there was like the 70s crew, and then it sort of rolled into the 80s. And, me and Beckler kind of pushed back on, I mean, we didn't like it because it was like a big group and there were a lot of hanger-oners, people that just showed up to party. But I think there was a little bit of, we were really serious about the climbing in it.
I've heard the DLFA referred to as a drinking group with a climbing problem.
Well,
So I could see you guys not like fully getting into that because you're not going to get much climbing done there.
no, and my partnership with Rich was sort of, I mean, we became really close friends, but when I first started to climb with him, it was a little out of necessity. I mean, I needed a climbing partner, and my friend Ken Sauls had moved to Colorado. Sangdol had moved. Usually guys start there a handful of years and then they take off. So incidentally, one of the things I wanted to say about Devil's Lake, and not just the DLFA, but the whole Devil's Lake community, there's an incredible sort of overstory there of really good climbers coming out of the lake between, Cleveland. And I mean, there's weird guys like Bob Horan started climbing at Devil's Lake. There's a pretty long list of really accomplished climbers that cut their teeth there. And I think all of those guys looked at Cleveland and Gill and this sort of super old overstory. There was a guy named Al Chekalinsky, and a lot of people, Scott Stewart just got kind of, sort of forgotten in that whole mess. He was a really good climber. But there was this incredibly strong overstory that guys like us took on. And, we'd go west. I remember Rich did the third ascent of the Wisdom Roof. And in Boulder, these guys were like, some fucking dude from Devil's Lake just did the Wisdom, and, you'd get attention, doing stuff like that. They were like, these guys don't mess around. We'd come out there and do some really hard stuff, like climbing, the edge back in early and mid 80s and stuff like that, Jules Verne, things like that didn't get done all the time. So there was that, and I think that really helped with, like, for us, it's like, we had to look at, I think that young guys do, they look at what we did and say, hey, we're going to dial that up a notch, we're going to do what they did and maybe go a little beyond,
Why do you think that Devil's Lake has been so successful at breeding climbers to go elsewhere? Like, what is it about the lake specifically?
There's a lot of climbs there. Number one, there's 1,200 routes there. The quality of the stone's really good. There's a seriousness to it. And I think the nature of that rock, I think it's very easy if you embrace it and put your shoulder to the wheel and do the hard routes there, you can get a lot of skill. I mean, it teaches you, obviously, beyond incredible finger strength, right? I mean, you're never going to blow off the 512 face climb finish of anything you're going to do if you're a Devil's Lake climber, you're going to hit that and feel pretty at home, I think that aspect of it. And then when I started, there were like these pockets of rock climbing, like people climbed in the Gunks at Seneca, they climbed at Devil's Lake, they climbed at Yosemite, climbed in Eldorado. And I mean, there were all these other places, but those were kind of the crucibles of it. And Devil's Lake was always sort of included in that sort of initial 70s, 80s free climbing crucible. And I think that's important. And now it's just kind of overshadowed. And I don't know what my friend Chris Gorney had, one of his Polish friends had some comment. He goes, Devil's Lake was sandbagged into obscurity.
He's not wrong there. I remember
Yeah.
growing up in Baraboo and feeling such a sense of pride that Devil's Lake was on, like, was one of those, like you said, crucibles for climbing. Like hearing about Pete Cleveland and his first ascent of Son of Great Chimney, and then hearing about, and climbing with you and climbing with Zishi. Like I just the sense of like hometown pride that I've always felt about that area, because it's like this sleepy state park. I guess not sleepy in the summer, but like climbing wise, a sleepy state park, but with so many routes and such a like vibrant history and the ability to really push yourself. I've always felt that. And I've always talked about Devil's Lake no matter where I am. And people have heard about it. They haven't necessarily climbed there, but they've heard about it.
I think there's also an element that it's big enough to get good, but if you live there, you're gonna travel.
Yeah, you have to.
And really what you learn in climbing, it doesn't matter where you are. I mean, there's some areas that are big enough that you can kind of isolate in it for a career, but those places are rare. I mean, but Devil's Lake, you get out and you get on the road, and I think that's part of it. And guys, it was the typical thing there was, train up, go out, come back, climb with your buddies, tell some war stories, And I mean, the big thing when I started to climb there in the early 80s, it was pilgrimages to the valley in Eldorado were the places. People would go to the gunks and all these places, like, because that's what people were doing. Like literally the first year I climbed, I ended up in the valley, doing Royal Arches, doing the Cookie Cliff, so like right out of the box, people are like, oh, did you learn how to crack climb? Well, you had to crack climb, that was all this is what it was, besides Devil's Lake. So
I remember the first time I climbed at Aldo, I was like, this feels just like home. Like it's bigger than Devil's Lake, but the climbing style is really similar. I'm like, that makes total sense that a lot of the movers and shakers at Devil's Lake moved to Aldo and started doing hard routes there. Like there's definitely a line that you can draw from Devil's Lake to like the technical, steep sandstone, small gear, very fiddly protection that you would get at Devil's Lake.
yeah, definitely. It's very similar. In some places it's, identical. There's, obviously there's places where there's a little more friction,
Yeah.
but yeah.
There are people who thrive on that style, and I would assume you're one of them. I mean, I've got a picture of you leading Flake Route way back in the day, like not the first lead of Flake Route, but like it's an early lead of Flake Route, and on your gear sling, there's like all this like small gear, and like it looks so retro. I mean, it is a retro picture, but like how did you learn protection or enhance your protection abilities by climbing on that quartzite?
Well, I think there was always some element at the lake of, and this is part of that overstory of where like a lot of times you needed a little bit of bait on what you were doing with, especially with the gear we had. But I mean, it was just slinging gear. I mean, for me, one of the biggest things with being good at gear was just going to the valley and like doing some walls, right? You do a couple walls, you put in a lot of gear.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of placements.
Right? So, I mean,
Yeah.
I knew that was part of the gig. You get good at all the rigging and hauling and aid climbing, and you come back maybe with a little greater sense of what you can trust. But it was just doing the time, putting in the gear. I mean, people were careful about how much, like nowadays, these guys really scope the routes out. I mean, we'd maybe like take a wire and go, oh, that looks like it'll go. I mean, there had to be still some element of not having the thing mercilessly wired with the gear, which maybe was a mistake. But, we were careful with that style, like you said, when that rolled into the bolting aspect, like how much bolts you're going to put in and not to overbolt and, not to over rehearse. I think when I led Bagatelle, I think I had done the route 6 times or 5 times on top rope. I mean, I knew it, but I didn't have it mercilessly wired.
For Devil's Lake, that's practically an on-site.
Correct. Yeah. But if you would have did it like 30 times, people would have said, oh, he's just got it mercilessly wired, you know?
Yeah, right. If I were to ever lead that, I probably would want to do like 100 laps on it beforehand. Remove all uncertainty
Yeah.
whatsoever. Who did the first lead on Bagatelle?
Tommy Deutschler.
Deutschler did. Were you shortly thereafter?
You know, it wasn't that close. His was like 79, and I think I was like maybe 85 or 86, something. I should know the date of that. Some of these things just kind of run together because I had this argument with my brother. My brother's a climber too, and we were talking about shit we did in the valley, and he's like, "No, you're way off on that." And I was like, by like 5 years, and I was like, I had to go back and look at photos to actually remember when we did it, you know?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I remember sitting in Yosemite talking to Bill Russell about Tommy's ascent, and there was all kinds of different, hey, he did it this way and he did it that way, and you know, climbing's always been one of these things where a guy says he does something. In those days, you know, you just do it. There wasn't, you know, you just, yeah, he did it. That's just the way it is, you know.
Yeah.
Put it this way, the story was never straightforward. And depending on how many, like, which part of the day I caught Bill Russell and how many cans of Old English were in, you know, I heard like a different version of that story.
That's one thing I remember with the guidebook is like, I'd ask a question and I'd get like 5 different answers from 2 different climbers. It's like, just give me some info. Like, well, it could have been this way. It could have been that way.
Yeah, I realize as I get older, some of it, you know, you can confuse like, you know, semantic memory to episodic memory pretty easy.
It's true even if it didn't happen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, and nevertheless, to launch up on that route, even if he hung on a piece or whatever may have happened, to launch up on that with a handful of knife blades, small wires, and vast ascenders is pretty goddamn bold.
Did Tommy hang on a piece on the first ascent? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't know that. There was a lot of back and forth about that. I remember you asked me when you did the guidebook, and I said, that's not my place. If he wants to say that, you know, he can go ahead and say it. But, you know, it's like oftentimes with second ascents, you know, maybe the style's better.
Yeah.
You know, somebody does a better style on a second ascent, you know?
Yep. Which is to say, it takes nothing away from the earlier one, right? It just took somebody to get up there and try it and go for it. And then you can always better the style. You can always better the style.
Yeah, I was fishing through some old slides looking for actually some early 80s like pictures of training where like we feel like we were maybe the first generation of guys to train, right? With backer ladders, crack machines. I had a hangboard in my backyard with wooden blocks, you know, kind of pre-plastic. And so I was hunting around for, you know, pictures of some of that stuff, you know, just to see what I could, you know, find on the training aspect of it.
Well, something that happened, I noticed, is that you guys got strong. I mean, you climbed at Devil's Lake and you were doing a lot of the 12s and everything. And then all of a sudden you started doing the 13s and you did some of the 13 leads at the lake, of which there are not many. And I might have the timeline wrong here, but then you started bolting, you started developing, and you and Rich started putting up some pretty hard local test pieces, both in the Wisconsin area and then down in Southern Illinois. And I sort of want to talk about that, like that transition of that trad background and then really making the transition to bolting sport roots. And I talked to Chris Snyder about this a lot during the Red River Gorge episode when he was talking about developing the Red. And it was really interesting that this transition was occurring throughout the country at about the same time. And the level of communication between areas wasn't the same as it is now. You were all sort of doing it at the same time, maybe figuring it out on your own, maybe communicating with each other. But it was interesting that this transition was happening kind of all at once throughout the country.
Yeah, I think the source of information there was largely like climbers on the road, trading information, seeing what was done. And then, you know, the little monthly climbing magazine bleeps in there, which I wish I'd saved more of these little clips, you know. But anyways, like I'd mentioned earlier, we went to a bunch of us guys went to a road trip down to Arapalis, and we went down there for like 6 weeks, and we flew down there.
This is in Australia. Yeah.
In Australia, yeah, myself, Rich Beckler, Leo Hermazinski, and Hank Saab, and we stayed down there. And and that was the first time we went down there to do badass quartzite, leads, right? And we'd seen the pictures of Gulick and all these guys down there, and some of the Australian guys, Malcolm Matheson, and we're like, we got to check this out, So, we were all pretty good at leading 512 on RPs and small wires and stuff. So, but at the time, these guys had started sport bolting, so we got down there and we're like doing some of these sport routes, and I think it was called Fly or Die, was maybe like the first sport route I ever did. It was like 12A or B or something. And by the time we'd left there, I think I had like a couple hard 12s done. And we're like, hey, this is fucking cool. I mean,
you're like, what am I doing with these RPs, these tiny nuts?
Yeah. Because you know what it's like for any athlete. I mean, the gear is part of it, but the experience is to climb cool features as hard as you can. And, sport climbing just changed how I looked at stuff. And we're like, wow, that not only, I'm not looking at it for a crack for protection. I'm looking at it like, what's the cool line, or, what would be the best feature to climb on this thing? So, yeah, we came back from that. I think at time I was living. So my whole 20s, I pretty much lived on the road. I mean, home base was the Midwest. I'd come home, I'd work. I was a tradesman. So I did what most climbers did. I had to work, 6 months of the year. I'd jump in my van and head wherever I was going, or go to Europe, and so it was always a mix of work and then being on the road. And that's how I pretty much spent my 20s. And I remember I was living in El Paso, and I had I did a work gig down there. And, it was bouldering at Waco, which was awesome time to be there. I mean, it was when Waco just exploded, all these foreign climbers. I think I had Ron Kauk and Russ Walling living in my apartment for a couple of weeks,
That's so cool. And that's before all the restrictions and everything. It was probably just a free for all.
It was a Wild West show, yeah. There's a picture of Todd Skinner and a bunch of guys in Lycra standing there with Ranger Bob in his orange jumpsuit. And I said, all you have to do is look at that photo and to need to know the whole story. It tells the whole story.
You knew what was coming.
Right. But when I left El Paso, I sold my little Mustang and I bought a Volkswagen van and a power drill. I went down to the Hilti store and I bought a Hilti power drill, and I hit the road and came back. And remember, we had a meeting in the spring at Devil's Lake at one of these little campgrounds we were staying at with a bunch of guys. And me and Beckler kind of piped up and said, hey, we're going to go up to Necedah and start putting up sport routes. And immediately put up like Death of a Salesman and Rebel Yell and Whiskey, pretty much within that year. And to your point, when we got strong is when, I think for me, it was, quitting drinking. There's a little bit of a story behind that, quitting drinking and then training. And then ultimately, crazily enough, what sort of pushed me into maybe being able to climb 13A to being able to climb hard 13 was having a kid living at one place and training, really focused on training. I had the time to train and boulder because, when you have kids, bouldering's easy. And you got plenty of time to train, and you're not out partying and
partying, traveling, that's tough on the body, right? Like you need to slow things down in order to get strong.
So when my son was born, it was more focused on going down to Southern Illinois for a week. I mean, when me and Beckler showed up down there, there were literally 6 routes,
which is amazing. There's so many threads I want to follow on this with what you said, but the Southern Illinois, Jackson Falls area is just amazing. And it's kind of unheralded even now. But back then, I can imagine just how just a blank on the map it was. You just drive down these random roads, you park at the top and hike down, and there's just these cliffs all over the place with no routes. Even now there's potential down there.
Yeah, you should probably interview a guy named Jim Thurman, who was a Southern Illinois guy. And so we went down there, met the local guys. You know, we thought it would be a little contentious, and we were just approached them and said, "Tell us what you don't want us to climb. Make a list that's reasonable, and then we'll
Not
stay
what we
off of
can
those
climb.
things.
What can we not climb?
What can we not climb?" And they're like, "We'll stay off this, this, and this." So we started to develop over there, and I was friends with Tim Tula was a good friend of mine. So we were talking with these guys, and so we went over to the Red and climbed with Tula and Porter Jarrard, and saw what they were doing over there. And at the time, it was a travesty. I mean, it was so poor and so much garbage, and you had to show up at the crag with your windows rolled down with all your gear in the campground. They would just break into your car and steal your shit.
Like the locals, not Porter and, and
Not
Tim
Porter.
Tula.
But so they had like a handful of routes, and me and Rich looked at it and said, well, Southern Illinois is really peaceful, and we liked the style of climbing a little more. And we said, well, what are we doing here? And at the time, in their defense, it was just military wall. Like a lot of that stuff opened up years later. So what we saw of it at the time was just kind of military and a few other things.
Which is good, but not otherworldly like the Mother Lode would be, right? Like
Yeah,
it's
correct.
good. Yeah.
So we went back to Southern Illinois, and we liked the sort of, and both of us, the other side of that sport climbing thing is Arapiles was the sort of thing, but then I traveled to Europe. I saw what was going on there. You know, when I was in my mid 20s, I spent a summer living in Chamonix, alpine climbing. And then I went back a couple years later and spent a fall in South France, with all the same sport climbing guys I had met and guys I knew from the valley, guys I knew from Waco. So you'd show up there and you didn't even need to show up with a partner. Like I'd show up in Buttes and I climbed with a bunch of guys from the East Coast. And so, that was all part of it. Like you said, how did you communicate? But a lot of it was just being on the road, seeing what guys are doing. But I always felt Southern would catch up, that it would have its own little following. And maybe, maybe we thought, well, maybe we're ahead of our time a little bit with this place because everything there is really technical.
Yes.
And if you're not a really good rock climber, if you're just sort of a gym climber and really strong, you can get shut down. I mean, there's stuff where the crux, like I did this thing, Zen Arcade down there, and the crux of it was like this weird sandstone mantle on this horn. Well, you did like maybe a V5, V6 boulder problem through this roof. And then you had to do some weird mantle on a horn that was just like, at the time before like gyms and all the plastic, I mean, a lot of that movement just wasn't super natural. Now these comp kids, I'm surprised they haven't flashed the thing,
Yeah, that's a gorgeous wall with Zen Arcade. And isn't there manufacturer's consent is on there?
Yeah.
Which I actually have a note to ask you about this because that's a Noam Chomsky book, right? So like,
Correct.
were you reading Noam Chomsky back then?
I've been a Chomsky fan, yeah.
Well, is it named after the book or is it named after a technique that occurred prior to the first ascent on it?
No, it's named after the book because we always felt like, especially with these sport climbs, we always felt that there was some element of, manufacturing consent in some of these grades and ideas and stuff, right?
So it wasn't like manufacturing holds.
No. There was no holds manufactured.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Zen Arcade went up first, and then manufacturing consent. I did that with a fellow named Tom Ramier. Zen Arcade went up first, and then there was another line that, with manufacturing consent, it's a little easier. I think it's still, those routes still like held their 13A. Grade. I'm surprised. Yeah, 13A, and they never. I've always tried to grade fairly. I've always been surprised, like some of these grades have stood the test of time. I didn't want to sandbag, but I didn't want to make it, overgrade it.
It's such a subjective. It's like throwing a dart in the dark. Like it's so hard to figure out what your first ascent is rated. Like totally, you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to undergrade it. Like, yeah,
you become so biased because you're so close to. Like just this last week, I put a couple routes up. I drilled a couple routes, and it's really hard to grade because you're cleaning it, brushing it, drilling it, and you know every little nuance to it, like you'd been on the thing 20 times before you ever do the first ascent, you know.
Yeah, your depth of knowledge is not what the second ascent or any subsequent ascent would have.
Yeah. I've never read that book Hangdog Wars, but I kind of need to.
The Hangdog Days with the Jeff Smoot book.
Yeah, yeah, because like I was telling you, we were like waist deep in that whole mess. You know, like it kind of started in the valley with the divergence of the hardcore valley guys just being like, this is wrong, this is not what climbing is. And they took a left turn, and the sport climbing community took a right turn. And it turned out, you know, I mean, there were fist fights, and you know, Skinner had a route up that somebody put axle grease on. I mean, just crazy stuff, you know.
I know there's the famous fist fight that happened in Camp 4 with Ron Kauk and somebody, I can't remember who, but were you involved in any sort of like local altercations with the traddies? I think of the, Chicago Mountaineering Club, like the CMC, which the DLFA was very much a counterpoint to. Like, did you get any static from the more traditionally minded people in the local Devil's Lake or Southern Illinois regions?
You know, when we had our little talk about it with what we consider the sort of relevant local guys, there were a few dissenters, you know, that were like, no, we think all this should stay. And we prefaced the whole thing with saying, we don't think we should ever put a bolt in Devil's Lake, period.
No.
You know,
Yeah.
period, full stop, you know.
Yeah.
And we're like, we got these other areas in central sandstone that we feel should be bolted. And part of it was somebody said, you know, like somebody said, why did you bolt whiskey? I said, can you imagine what that thing would look like after 30 years of throwing wires in it?
Oh, it would be blown out. That sandstone's so soft.
It'd be blown out, yeah.
And nobody would climb it, also. A few people would climb it.
To be quite honest, I mean, there just wasn't that many like hardcore guys. And I think most of the climbing community, I think after just several years of talking about sport climbing, seeing the sport climbing come around, I think most people embraced it pretty fast. I mean, if you remember correctly, I mean, even Backer and those guys, after like 3-4 years, threw in the towel and went up to Smith Rocks. And I think they quickly realized that maybe there's more to this than they thought. You know, like John thought, well, I'm just going to go up there and do to bolt or not to be. And
yeah, and he got shut down.
He got shut down. You know.
Yeah.
And I was in the Skinner camp, you know, kind of, he was a friend of mine, and you know, and I was pretty close with like Kauk and those guys, and they kind of jumped in too, you know. I mean in those days it was funny because in those days, once you were in your 30s, like that was considered like over the hill, you know, which is like crazy when you think about that in the lens today. You know, there's guys still out there in their 50s, like climbing, you know, 514, you know.
Yeah, right.
And it's just the whole idea about training and all that stuff is just so different. So,
well, and it was a much smaller gene pool too, right? Like we've got just the law of averages. Like having more people involved in climbing now, you're going to get more variation on who's climbing hard and who's climbing hard for a long time. And like, it was such a small community back then.
Yeah, somebody asked me about what I thought about British climbing, and I said there's such a huge pool of athletes that by nature you're going to get some genetic outliers that are going to float to the top of that pile, like, you know, guys like Jerry Moffat, you know, and people like that. Like in my day, and you know, he was like one of the British guys, Ben Moon, you know, those guys were just really strong.
Did you ever get to climb with either of them or see either of them at the crag?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I never roped up with any of those guys. I mean, I'd meet him at belay stations, see him in Camp 4. I remember I was with Leo when we were climbing up at Standage, and there was this one night we were in the bar, and it was loaded with all the who's who of British climbing, from Andy Pollitt to Jerry Moffat to Ben Moon to the Crusher. Everybody's drunk as $700, you know. I mean, you remember that stuff. I mean, it was cool to be part of that because, you know, the community was so small. Like, you know, my friend Leo was, well, we're going to go over there. I hear these guys are going to be at this, you know, see this band. So it was like the who's who of English climbing in the bar one night.
Yeah, that must have been something. And then so like you're traveling, but you keep coming back to the Midwest. Like you keep coming back, like bringing what you learned from climbing in these brighter lit arenas back to Devil's Lake, Southern Illinois, Necedah, Hillbilly Hollow. Were there others doing that, or were you kind of the one? I feel like you were kind of the one who was like dragging these areas into modernity.
I think that's fair. I never like to, I never like to look at that as a solo venture because I always had partners and, people along the way, like Rich, who was kind of on board with it. But, part of it for me, the Midwest thing was, back in the 80s and 90s, the work that I did as a tool maker, you just couldn't go to Denver and get a job in that. I mean, I had to work in the Midwest, or like at one point I was going to move to California. I found a job in the LA area. I mean, I had to live in a big city and you got to make money. And so, once my son was born, that changes the dynamic of everything. And so, I just had a career, but yeah, your observation is right. I mean, part of it was what I learned 10 years on the road, saw with sport climbing. We kind of realized, hey, that's really the way to do this. And I look at sport climbing as, and even my little area here in La Crosse that I'll head out to after the interview, our little Dolomite area. I mean, if you didn't have sport climbing there just wouldn't be any climbing there, period.
Oh, 100%.
It's just that's the way these areas are, right? And so we recognize that, and we recognize that sandstone needed a little different ethic and a little different approach. We had taken a trip to Czechoslovakia in the 80s, me and Beckler, and we got visas and went in there when it was still communist and did a handful of routes.
Wow. Like with like knots for gear?
I did one thing that was like 11D, and I put in 3 knotted slings and 2 bolts, and it was like 130 feet.
Oh, gee. Makes Devil's Lake look tame. You could actually use metal gear in Devil's Lake.
It was cool. I mean, we thought we would show up there and like maybe meet some local guys that would kind of take us around and we'd stay longer, but we didn't have a car, and there was no guidebooks. The language was impossible. Nobody spoke English. So we ended up in this place, Sutra Scali, where we climbed for like a couple weeks. And we were finally like, okay, we were spending the summer in the Franken year is what we were doing in Germany. So we just headed back. It was like enough, and it was hard to get food. And it felt we never felt dangerous, but you don't know in a country like that. I remember one time we got lost heading back to this town, and we ended up, we had to find some Czech guy on a map who said, you're here. And we're like 20 miles out of the way. It was an adventure for sure. We remember the beer was good and it was hard to get food. I mean, it was at the very end days of communism when the whole thing was just sort of falling apart,
Wow.
But it was cool to see the Czech areas because they're not unlike areas in the Midwest. The rock is very similar. The sandstone's very similar. Like it's sort of a cross between Southern Illinois and Necedah.
Interesting.
Yeah, similar stone, like one part's really good and then the next part's kind of chossy. Like you're on this tower and, it's like Mill Bluff State Park. Like one side of the tower, the rock's really good, and you go to the other side of the tower and it's just junk.
I have so many questions that are very obscure because I've finally got you on the pod to talk to you about this. But like, did you ever climb at Rochecree?
That was the one place that we never touched. And there, if you're a boulderer, it would be something to look at because there's bands of boulders on the upper tier of that thing. But it had petroglyphs on it, and it was very well protected from the 70s.
Oh, so it was never open. I
It was
remember
never open.
Yeah, it was always closed for me.
But so that area, all those towers, all those areas in there are like towers from Glacial Lake, Wisconsin.
Right, on the summit of Necedah, you can look over and you can see Rochecree way over to the, I guess, east, right?
I would encourage anybody in the Midwest to hike up the top of Rochecree because they have a really nice map of all the different towers that you can see from Rochecree. And there's 2 or 3 of those sandstone areas that are on private land that if we could purchase some would be really good crags where you'd add like, like maybe 20 or 30 routes.
Really?
And if you've never climbed in England, I would like I was telling my son, I said, get out of here, go over there because you'll love it, like Gritstone. And you jump in your car and you climb in this little area, and then you drive 20 miles over here, and there's another area. And central Wisconsin's sort of like that if it was all legal. We have weird private property rules here, which, like in Germany, like the Frankenmuir, most of those crags are on private property, but they couldn't keep people from climbing on them.
Oh, interesting.
England's the same way. Like, like Cayley and some of these places were private property, but you could still climb there.
Isn't there a law in England where you're just allowed to sort of camp or sleep anywhere, irrespective of private property rights? Like it's sort of like a holdover from the medieval days where you could just travel through the countryside and just sleep wherever.
I think so. I think you can go anywhere for sure. You can walk anywhere.
Okay. I was in Scotland this last winter up on Ben Nevis, and somebody was telling me that like at least in Scotland you can do that.
Yeah, I listened to your episode, and I've had some friends that when I took a trip there in the mid early 80s, and we climbed like 5 of the big routes, the psychedelic wall and zero and point 0.5, and what did I climb with Errol? I think it was Psychedelic Wall with Errol and Orions and stuff. But he was on that trip with me. I got some cool pictures from that. But anyways, it makes me kind of sad now when you see it because I just don't think it ever comes into that condition. I mean, when we were there, it was covered in ice.
Oh, it wasn't the case. Yeah, it was raining and like it was different than like the historic pictures I'd seen. But I guess it comes in at times. It's just maybe not as consistent as it was back in the day.
Yeah, it's the first place I've ever seen an icicle that was coming out at like a 45-degree angle or something, right? And you're like, I don't want to be here when this is happening.
And it's like 31 degrees out, Fahrenheit.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like, this isn't going to stay.
Yeah, it was interesting. The summer I spent in Chamonix, there was an interesting story where these Scottish guys were in there, like they have the same, brings the memory up because your story with in France, you can't be arrested for stealing food, right? From the medieval where they cut people's hands off. Yeah. So these Scottish guys would just take full advantage of that. They just go in the grocery store and just fill their bags up full of food.
That's not good.
And just walk out. And the locals got so fed up with it, they took one of these guys and they took him down to the gendarmerie for the day and like chained him to a pole. And then had to let him go at the end of the day.
Things are different in Europe. Well, one of the reasons why Jerry Moffat and Ben Moon could climb so hard for so long is they were on the dole. During the Thatcher administration, like there was like terrible inflation. There was the economy was terrible. They had young people couldn't find jobs, so they were on the dole, meaning they were getting paid not to work, and that policy created, in some ways, modern sport climbing because it gave them the time, the energy, the money to really pursue climbing as a primary focus.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it created a generation of badass head pointers and British climbers for sure. Alpinists too. I mean, if you look at, the world's greatest, it's loaded, for a small island, the climbing world's loaded with really famous British climbers. And I always looked at that was one of the crucibles, of rock climbing, like Yosemite. I always think there's 3 of them: Yosemite, England, and Devil's Lake, right?
Not in that order. I think Devil's Lake first and then the other 2.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, one of the things I always say is that Devil's Lake is the Yosemite of the Midwest, but actually Yosemite is the Devil's Lake of the West.
For sure.
It was a great place to grow up.
What year did you graduate from high school and start climbing?
I graduated in 96, and I started climbing probably, I think I had climbed a little bit in like 93, 94, but like 95, 96 is when I really started climbing, and then climbed through college up at Oshkosh, driving down to the lake all the time. And then, moved away in 2002.
Yeah, I remember with like you and Eric and those guys and some of your real formidable years. I know I was still climbing there, but I wasn't climbing a lot.
You were like, who's this sketchy young dude who like doesn't have any footwork, whipping on upper diagonal? Who's this guy?
Yeah. No, I don't know. Was Eric? Is he about the same age as you, or is he a little? Is he a little?
Zishi?
No, Bernard.
Oh, Eric Bernard. We're about the same age. Yep. He was more into the bouldering scene than I was. I was like still fancying myself as like a I hesitate to even say it, but like a big wall climber, like gonna go climb in Yosemite, like, way trad. And like, so I was definitely not bouldering with that crew as much back in the
Yeah,
day.
yeah.
But I did the same. I'd like start at Devil's Lake. I'd like learn to haul at Devil's Lake. I'd learn to aid climb at Devil's Lake and then try to go to Yosemite and put those things in practice.
Sure. Yeah, I always think for any young climber to just go there and do like a big wall, it teaches you just a ton, you know?
And it's conducive. Like, I mean, Devil's Lake's very short, but like your ability to use the gear and your ability to protect like weirdly protectable things. Like, I think
Yeah.
it's a good training ground.
So I figured out, like, I sat down once and I was like, how much time have I really spent in the valley? And if I, just kind of loosely added up all my things, it wasn't like a year, but it was at least like 9 months of my life in there.
9 months, like actual, like the number of days would,
Yeah, the time that I actually spent in the valley climbing.
wow, that's
It was a
awesome.
lot, like back in the early 80s. And then I went back in the sort of 90s, kind of early 2000s with my brother, and we did all the old Stonemaster routes, some which I had done before and others which I, hadn't done, like the Crucifix, which is really a fabulous climb.
Where is that?
It's on the Upper Cathedral,
Oh,
Jim Bridwell kind of route. It's like 12BR,
whoa.
but it has a 12B pitch and then it has an 11D pitch that are R, and then the rest of it's like fist crack. But it's a really good line. It's like one of the super old school kind of, before it became vogue to free El Cap. It's like definitely a step up from Astro Man, a little
Okay.
tougher than Astro Man. But
Have you done Astroman?
yeah, I did it in the mid 80s with Jose Perea. And
Really?
we climbed it in like 4.5 hours. And then I went back and I did it with my brother when I was like in my early 40s.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah, so I've done it a couple times.
Did you notice that it felt different when you were in your 40s versus when you were in, I'd assume, your 20s, maybe?
Oh, yeah, yeah, for sure. Especially like the Harding slot. And I was think for me, I remember the first time I did it, I don't remember like getting into the Harding slot being like all that crazy. But when I did it the second time, it was like, to me, that was just the absolute crux of the thing. All the other stuff was pretty like, have you done it?
No, I've never done it.
You sort of work up this overhanging 511 thin hand crack into this Bombay chimney. And at some point you chicken wing your arm up and you got to like commit. And sort of at one point you just sort of work your upper body into the Harding slot, and you got to cut your feet loose and like wiggle them up into the thing. And and to think that Warren Harding did that with like no big cams and is sort of crazy. You're like, that's just hardcore. I mean, he probably still had to free climb the hardest move on the frickin' thing.
Right, because you can't aid that.
Not with the stuff he had, unless he had some kind of weird bond or something he was stick. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. Some shenanigans.
You can walk a cam up through the thing. It isn't like totally doesn't protect that. It protects fine. It's just awkward and difficult.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, so me and him went back in our 40s and knocked a bunch of these things out, and it was a really good exercise. But took take over a bunch of years just getting back in there.
Yeah, to bring it back to the lake, I'm just sort of like paging through the guidebook, and I'm like last great problems at Devil's Lake, and there's one that is sort of front and center in my mind, which is the seam at new sandstone, which we should preface this by saying new sandstone is closed. But if it ever opens, that seam, that's the fuck aid seam. Do you remember that climb?
Yes.
What's up with that? Did you guys try it?
We did, and it was the reason, and I was the one responsible to put fuck aid there in chalk, because there was some guys from the CMC like aid climbing it, which in retrospect, I probably should have let them aid it a little more. They might have banged it out a little more.
Oh, so they were using pitons and stuff.
They
and
were
like
using steel, but I think the fear was they were going to hook on something and blow off a critical handhold.
Okay, so you wrote that in chalk.
I did. I'm the guilty party there. and the so we had tried that, and it just, I think Sky Groki's been working on it, and it I think it just blanks out. You know, one of these deals where regardless of how well you can boulder, there's just a section there where there just isn't shit to grab, you know?
Yeah. I know Jason Houston was working it back in the day. I tried it once. It seems possible. Like, I don't totally remember because it was a long time ago, but I think you can get past that blank section with some funkiness, I think. But like Jason was close. He was like, I don't know if he was one hanging it but he was close on sending that.
Yeah, I went down there recently and just took a look at them and look at those routes again. You know, we worked on that thing, shaking hands with the chimp. We worked on that hard. I mean, Rich was like, he was hell-bent to put up a 513 at Devil's Lake. He's like, we're going to put up 513 at Devil's Lake. So we worked on, I think I first did it like somewhere in the late 80s. I can't remember. Like I said, all the dates kind of blend, but it might have been like 88. But we were both pretty close on it. But yeah, we had tried that. And there's a couple other things there. There's another sort of seam off to the left that has never been done. And
oh yeah, left of Donkey Dihedral, like that amazing looking seam. That looks like more of a highball boulder problem, but it looks incredible.
Yeah, and I also worked on that face around the corner from Donkey to the left a little bit. But like a lot of those sandstone things, it just kind of blanks out. And I think maybe had the rock been better, it'd been more like gritstone, where it wasn't so sandy. Maybe they would have went a little bit, you know. I mean, would those things clean up in time? Probably. But I think it's not super overgrown in there, but it's a little overgrown.
What in your mind is like the last great problem at Devil's Lake or surrounding areas? Like what is a line that could go that hasn't gone yet?
I don't know. At the lake, I kind of feel like, I don't know. I mean, people will still unearth stuff, but I kind of feel like a lot of the stuff was unfortunately kind of hit. You know, once you get north of 13, like I was tempted with that thing Dyslexia to rate it 14A. And, you know, I've always been, like I said, I wasn't careful because I didn't want my stuff to get downgraded. But I mean, there's just, you hit a certain point where in order to go beyond that sort of mid-high 13 grade, I think you really need some element of endurance in it.
Yeah.
Steepness and endurance. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. Unfortunately, like there's just not the unbroken steepness that would lend itself to like the higher sport grades, the higher root grades.
Yeah, I mean, you can have like a couple really hard or even, you know, even like a double-digit boulder move in there. But I mean, at some point when you got something that's 40, 50 feet tall, and even if it's got some really hard boulder sequence, it's just hard to throw those big numbers on it. So I think the lack of steepness makes it, you know.
Yeah, I gave Dyslexia in the guidebook 13D, which I think that's what you told me to say.
I think that's fair. I mean, I know the only guys that have done it are me and Eric Zishi and Tony Brengos.
Yeah.
Have you done it?
No, I've tried it. It's hard to work because I don't know if I found a directional, but since you're top roping, like you do the move and then try the move and then you swing away.
Yeah, and unfortunately that tree fucks with it a little bit. Yeah, and it's like the crux of that Zishi was so I got a pen and ink drawing that he made of that thing in my living room, you know, that's kind of cool.
Oh, cool.
He was fascinated with it. He had like a little map for every move, every foot sequence. like highly detailed.
Really?
Like, and I can only imagine for every hard thing he's done, like that's just how his brain worked. He had like every little foot switch, every little timing. I mean, it was detailed like beyond belief. And he goes, look at this. And he shows me, he was just infatuated with this thing, and I think I had done it like maybe 3 or 4 times, but I think he probably did it way north of a dozen times. But the crux of it is like you're like dynoing for the tip. I call it's like dynoing for the tip of a steak knife.
Yeah, right. Very Devil's Lake.
Yeah,
Like a
exactly.
razor crimp.
Yeah, like a raised, like just like a little pointed thing that's literally like the end of a dull serrated knife.
Yeah, that's very descriptive. And then he did the modern art finish on sometimes, right? And has he linked the two maybe?
No, I don't know that it really sort of rolls that way.
Okay.
Recently these guys did this link up on Nisita and finished on up Ralph's route, Dish to Pass, up to Death of a Salesman. I think there's a couple things there to do, but you're filling in holes. You know what I mean? Like you're climbing little blank sections.
I saw that link up. I mean, everybody's seen that link up, right? But like I think you can do Death of a Salesman toward the end and then bust left into some new ground and finish closer to Whiskey a Go Go. Like I think you can do a relatively direct line up Dish to Pass over to Death of a Salesman, up 2/3 of that, then left again, and then up.
I agree with that. I've tried it, and
You have.
yes, there's just like one. There's some moves in there. I think it could go. Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind. I mean, for me, part of it too is the window when I was able to climb at those grades. I think on my 40th birthday I climbed like ice. I remember, so I could still climb, 13 into my sort of early 40s. And then life just sort of gets you. I'm running a
Yeah.
business, I'm traveling,
Yeah.
and then I've always, I have other things I like to do. I ski mountaineer and do some other things that eventually, it's hard to keep that rock climber body when you're just, most athletes I see, like a lot of climbers in their 40s, you can only just bathe in so much of it, and then
Yeah.
they're into distance running, or I got into cycling, which was horrible for my climbing, like
Oh,
road cycling.
100%. Those things are
Yeah,
torture devices. Like you're not
not
going to be able to
compatible.
climb at all.
Yeah, so I think that might have, it was good for like the aerobic part of my training, but yeah, so you have little diversions. Everybody, it's a long career. I think right now I've been climbing way north of 40 years. So now I've sort of evolved back to, I just retired here in the summer, and I'm back to sort of, spending time in my van and being able to go out and develop new routes. And I've been putting up a lot of easy routes, which I enjoy, and adding to the terrain. So
That's one thing that Andy Salo and I were talking about is like as we sort of age out of hard sport climbing, like what do we do? And I think we kind of came up with the idea that this is the time to do the stewardship. This is the time to do the LCO stuff. This is the time to develop routes that, maybe aren't, max difficulty for you, but like to give back to the community so that the youngins can focus on their hard climbing, and like those of us who have been around for a while are like taking care of the political stuff, taking care of the sustainability, the stewardship, the development of new areas. That made sense to me, like because I'm not going to be able to. I'm like desperately holding on to the bottom rung of hard climbing. Like my grip is loosening on the last rung of the hard climbing ladder. But like when that goes away, like there's a lot of challenge that's still available to help climbing.
yeah, and I've seen a lot of guys bail on climbing just because they can't handle that. You know, there is that day when you just can't. They have all this science and longevity stuff, but nevertheless, I know, when I was 30 years old and I could do, several one arm pull ups. Now I'm lucky to do 10 regular pull ups.
Yeah.
So I don't know. This gives me a little bit of a soapbox here to talk about what I consider like agency in the sport. And I feel like there's some there's a generation of guys who just kind of, their experience with climbing is just all kind of, I don't want to use the word taking, but
Transactional.
yeah, it is. And they, they just show up and they get kind of critical of how things are. And it's like, well, change it. There's some
Yeah.
things here, nature's fluid and these crags are fluid. And some of this stuff, especially, it was really refreshing to hear you talk with some guys from the Northeast about what it's like to climb in the Northeast, where I think there's this ethic out there in the Midwest or because of the West, where these guys would go into these desert bouldering areas and start fucking them up by brushing and cutting stuff. And like in the Midwest and in the Northeast, it's just not like that.
No.
There's some level of creation that has to happen with making an area so it's safe, so it gets the environment, keeps the, like it's like an ecosystem. And some of these areas, like the Wisconsin, they've taken all these areas and just sort of isolated them, and nobody does anything. They don't control any invasives. There's just no effort into some of the state natural areas. I mean, they just get put in this program and then they just get overgrown. And it's like, there's no fire, there's no logging, there's no, and traditionally the things that would keep those areas sort of open, there's this sort of time, that this bubble thinking that, we shouldn't touch anything. And it's like no brushing any lichen and then 10 years later, some little tree grows up and you can't do the route.
Or the case of, is it Governor Dodge, where those bolts are reaching the end of their lifespan, but like they're not allowed to be replaced or something. It's not like adding new bolts. And I might be operating on old information, but just sort of like on a general point, like,
No, I think we're going to get there though. So this last summer I went to Nisita and I burned through chronologically replacing. Like I replaced all my old routes, and then I replaced air and all the routes on Anita with these big Romer glue-ins, and I've
I
done
love the Rommers. They feel so solid. That's a big piece of metal right there.
They look solid and they feel solid. And I like a lot of things about them, because if you go to the 12 millimeter, there's some bolts that like I want to use that hole, but some of the things on Wisconsin sandstone are really hard to extricate.
Without breaking the rock.
Even pulling them with a puller, there's times when the cone, for whatever reason, they just get seized in there. You just can't get them out, and you'll loosen. And at some point, I got a couple techniques where I can literally just kind of drill under or over it with a bigger bit and then pull it, and then I can pull it. I drill alongside of it, and then I take a small drill bit and I'm putting in a 6-inch bolt on what was a 3-inch hole with some really, that Hilti glue that's super bomber.
Yeah,
So
the
the
red
ones
stuff.
that get the ones that get wonky like that, I'm replacing them with big, or the 8 millimeter twist ones that the Team Tough Guys make.
Yep.
Those are pretty good for those ones where the hole gets a little wonky.
Have you
And
tried the crossover bolt yet?
I have. I bolted a route with them last week. So
It took me a while to figure it out, but like now that I've figured it out, that just like hammering it a little bit sets it. Like, it's pretty cool.
the one thing I don't like about the wire bolts is, with the exception of the twist ones, they take a lot of glue.
Yeah, that's a good point.
They take a lot of glue. Like where a Romer, you're just not using as much glue.
Yeah, that's all metal in that hole.
Yeah, exactly. And so I wish, it's like a lot of things now. I mean, I wish I knew what I know now before I did a couple of the routes there, but that's the learning process.
Isn't that the natural order of things, where the people who have been around, like you said, you've been climbing for 40 years. I'm, coming up on, I guess, almost past 30 years. I'm coming up on 30 years. We're the ones who should be like doing these things. Like, it's okay that the gym climbers aren't doing that, or aren't focused on this kind of thing. Like, it takes this much experience and this much time on rock and understanding the nuances to like really do this well.
You're correct there. When you're in climbing, I think north of 20 years, you become like an outlier. I mean, I don't know
Yeah.
most of the guys are in for 5 to 8 years and they're kind of done, but it's going to take that. And that's my thing with some agency. There's some guys that need to like lens out and look at some of this and go, okay, what's in the best interest of, the area, the rock, the access. I mean, unfortunately in Wisconsin, we've been so beat down to be paranoid about access that a
Mm-hmm.
lot of things that should be done don't get done because of this constant overarching fear of access,
Mm.
because who it's owned by and we can't change any of it. It's really unfortunate. You wish you could have a sit down. I mean, I feel like that was my generation of the people in the DNR, and the people now that are kind of running the show kind of grew up with climbing, so it's a little more acceptable.
I was going to ask if it's changed because like climbing used to seem like a counterculture weird thing that, those sketchy guys out there climbing on those rocks but now it's a freaking Olympic sport. Like I mean, come on, like there's gyms everywhere, like, you
Yeah,
know.
for sure. For sure. I mean, I can tell you stories back in the 80s of going to the valley and at Devil's Lake, and the Rangers just, there was an alcohol ban there. So they're always looking for alcohol. And, I don't know if you remember those days. It was like a 6 or 8 week
Oh,
alcohol
I
ban in the
do
spring.
remember that.
Yeah, yeah. Rich, for the DLFA guys, that was hard to swallow. It's like,
Literally.
now you can't give up your morning coffee. But in the stories with, of the valley where they're just dragging people out of trucks and cars. I mean, it was like a war. And that's the
Yeah.
only way I can describe it. It was like a war between rangers and climbers, and they just saw climbing as so superfluous, and it was super contraculture. And but I think, from what I hear, my brother was just in the valley, like, I don't know, last year, and he said, Dave, it's completely different. I mean, they just completely accepted it. This is a world destination for climbing, and they seem to be like, okay, we're going to work with these guys. I think that was the upside of like the Free Solo movie.
Yeah.
I mean, it's people criticize it for sort of the, maybe glorifying free soloing, but I think it did a lot to bring like the sport like climbing to people's attention. I mean, I always think of climbing, especially alpinists. I mean, nowadays people, adorate all these military guys. I mean, these are some of the most badass guys in the world.
Oh, totally. Amazing athletes and adventurers. Yeah.
Yeah, the stuff we would do. I mean, it was one of the reasons I never joined the military. I didn't want to run around in cotton fatigues and play war games. I mean, we're in the mountains, climbing in Chamonix and, be doing real dangerous stuff.
Yeah, but you didn't want to be in the military having to do that wearing cotton.
No, not at all.
I remember early on during COVID, like when it was like there were lockdowns and stuff, and Lee and I actually went climbing in violation of the lockdown orders. And I was like, this feels like what climbing used to be. Like it's kind of a little bit of a protest. And it was like, don't tell anybody what you're doing. And it's like, man, this feels like climbing in the 90s to me. Like it's not so mainstream anymore. It actually feels kind of fun. I feel like I'm breaking the rules by going climbing.
Yeah, for sure. So
not that I advocate anybody do that, but it was an interesting throwback.
You spend your time, but I see her on your Instagram, but you seem like you're bouncing around a lot. Like you're in Lander, and then you're in the Red, and then you're out in New Hampshire. And
I am. I'm blessed post-COVID with work that is primarily online, so I have the most understanding, supportive wife ever to exist. So like I kind of go back and forth between Lander and New Hampshire. I'm trying to get out to Wisconsin to see my mom more, although my mom's in Patagonia right now. So
nice.
She's doing a trek down there. And yeah, I'm just kind of bouncing around, trying to, like I said, just hold on to that last rung of hard climbing.
Have you climbed in Patagonia?
Never. I've never been.
I would highly recommend it. And I went there when I was maybe in my early 40s to do Cerro Torre. And I had immediately had a lot of regret of waiting so long to get there.
Oh, really?
And yeah, we took 3 good whacks on the compressor route and got up on the head wall and just never had the weather to finish.
Oh, interesting.
As we sped up on the route, our weather window narrowed. So it was really disheartening. 10 years later, to see Dean Potter down there with like 30 days of sunshine.
Oh,
Oh, it's not that hard. And we're like, fuck you. It's like we're just struggling to get 2.5 days. But that's the way it goes.
Yeah, that's the way it goes in the mountains.
But I did climb some stuff over by Guizhoumet, and it's a place that I really want to get back to before, because there's all kinds of things there to do there. You don't have to, everything is not super badass. There's a million routes on all those spires. And you've got, like when I was there, it was the collection of the best climbers in the world in that campground. You're in there with Charlie Fowler and Jim Danini and, a bunch of guys that was like, it was everything you had envisioned it to be, right?
Sure, yeah, right.
Yeah, it was super cool. But if you get the chance to go down there, and you don't have to throw yourself, like I said, even just pick some 15 pitch sort of rock route and just knock it out and just check it out, because the place has just incredibly good like energy and scenery, and it's just awesome.
I'd love to check it out. I'll have to get the beta from my mom when she gets home.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, Dave, always my last question. Are you gates in or gates out?
I liked your Scottish guy who recently, when I listened to his, what was his name again?
Chris,
and he said, how could you get this so wrong? I'm gates out.
Hold on though, because I'm looking at your old classic pictures in the guidebook, and the one on Flake Route, you are very clearly, you have a gear sling, which that's a little anachronistic, but the gear sling with gates in on your gear sling. So you were gates in.
But the thing you got to remember about me is I'm highly dyslexic. So, I mean, everything with me is...
It could go either way.
There are no rules, yeah.
But I guess that makes sense.
When I started listening to your podcast, I had to honestly think about it. I'm like, I don't know, am I gates in? And then I looked at it, of course I'm gates out. And on my gear sling, I'm gates out, but sometimes I'll clip stuff and not pay attention to it.
Okay. So when you're not thinking about it, you clip it the natural way, which is gates in. So that makes sense.
I don't know that it makes a giant difference, but yeah, when I'm racking up on my sport harness, I'm gates out.
Okay. Well, Dave, thank you so much for stopping by. I feel like we could just go on and on and on about this history of, let's be honest, one of the best climbing areas in the country, Devil's Lake and surrounding spots. So thank you so much, Dave.
All right. Thank you. Yep.
Thanks for listening to this episode of First Ascent Podcast. If you liked what you heard, please rate and review us on your podcast platform. This is what keeps us going. And if you want more content, we have a Patreon page. You can search First Ascent Pod on Patreon. And finally, you can follow us on Instagram at First Ascent Pod, or my personal Instagram at JAYKNOWER. Thanks so much, and keep sending.